Welcome back. I'm joined today by a very prestigious guest, Baroness Minouche Shafik, who has been the director of the London School of Economics since 2017. Good morning, Minouche. How are you?
I'm fine, Charles. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. You are, aside from being the director of the LSE, the author of a book that I've recently read and reviewed called What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract. And we'll discuss that book shortly in the interview. Prior to your work at the LSE, you were the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, and before that, the Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. In 2020, you were named to the House of Lords as Baroness Shafik. You're the author of numerous books and publications, too many to enumerate here, so we'll dive right into the most relevant book of this conversation, What We Owe Each Other. Your book argues that under the twin stresses of technology and demographics, our current social contract has become unfit for purpose and needs to be overhauled. You outline a new social contract developed according to three broad principles. The first is to elevate a minimum social safety net to ensure a decent life to all members of society, maximizing opportunities for people to contribute to society to the best of their abilities, and finally, spreading risks of accidents, illness, unemployment, and so on across society rather than individuals. I guess my first question is really about the title. I'm very curious about it. Your book talks a lot about the social contract, and yet that specific phrase is relegated to a subtitle, and the main title is What We Owe Each Other. Does that editorial decision around the title reflect a deeper choice?
I think what it reflects is I wanted a title that would be intuitive and that would express the fundamental idea of the social contract, which is that we live in a society in which we have mutual obligations. And I was worried, I think, that if I used the term social contract in the title, people wouldn't know what I was talking about, and they would think this was some heavy philosophical tome that was derivative of Rousseau or something like that.
Right.
So I wanted something more intuitive, and I think that's why I chose the title.
I see. Okay. What specific events or circumstances drove you to start thinking of this issue of a social contract and its need for improvement, and ultimately to start writing this book?
Well, it was very clearly 2016 that made me think about writing this book. It was the year in which there was a sort of wave of populist leaders who were elected across the world, really. And for me, as someone who'd spent my whole career working on international development and who had seen the enormous progress that humanity has made in terms of getting kids into school, improving life expectancy, raising incomes, and reducing poverty in so many places, I was so puzzled by what are people so angry about? Why is it that despite these, measurable improvements in people's lives, we see all of this anger and division in our politics? And I wanted to understand what was behind it. And I thought, yes, some of it is about inequality and some of it is about identity, but there's something more profound here. And I wanted to get to the underlying causes, which is what led me to think about the social contract as being broken, and that's what people are ultimately angry about, that their expectations for their life are not being met.
So you opened the book with very powerful words. Society is everything. And Margaret Thatcher, whom you quote in the book in the introduction, when you're setting the parameters for what is a social contract, famously disagreed with that. She had a quote where she said, "There is no such thing as society." That specific opening, "Society is everything," seems to set the book in direct opposition to that political thinking. Was that the intention of anchoring your book in a certain political sphere?
Yes, actually, I have to confess, I did have her quote in mind, and I disagree with it. I think it reflects neglect of the fact that actually all of us benefit hugely by investments made by our predecessors, our parents, our grandparents, in previous generations. Many of the outcomes that happen in our life are really a function of what country we're born in and what family we're born into, and that has huge implications for our life chances. If you put the same individual and randomly have them be born in New York City or in London versus having them randomly born in Kinshasa in DRC, their lives will be completely different, even if it's identically the same person with the same set of skills and capabilities. And I think we have to acknowledge that where we're born and when we're born and what country we're born into and what family we're born into has a huge impact on the path that our lives take. And therefore, we have to care hugely about how our society is organized so that it creates fair outcomes for everyone.
Absolutely. And yet, part of what you argue that we owe each other goes through the state, specifically that ability, I would say, to bear risks that are too big for individuals to bear, the risk of becoming unemployed, for example. So are you arguing through your book that we could be using the apparatus of state, such as the government and its balance sheet, more intelligently? And do you think there is the political will, say, in the UK to do so? I think recent events that we're seeing in the UK, such as the most radical tax cut that we've seen in a few generations. Do you think there is that will to invest in society, or is that political, that libertarian political approach still very powerful in a country like the UK?
So one of the things I argue in the book is that people often think that the most important thing that the state does is what I call the Robin Hood function, transferring income from the rich to the poor. That's actually a very small part of what the state does. The most important thing that the state does is transfer income over our own lives. So if you're a clever child who's, let's just say you're a 5-year-old, you can't walk up to a bank and say, invest in my education, and when I get a job later, I'll pay you back. It doesn't work that way. That's what the state does. It invests in us when we're young. It asks us to contribute to society when we're working age through our taxes. And then in a good society, it also looks after us when we're older through pensions and healthcare. And that, what we call the piggy bank function, is the most important thing that the state does. And it's about investing in people and sharing risks over the course of a life. So for example, none of us know what our health will be in our life. And that's a risk that it makes sense to pool, as you said, across many people, because we don't know what health we will be born with. And it makes sense to have collective insurance across society to share that risk. So another good example, I think, is pensions. In many, many countries now, we've moved to what are called defined contribution pension schemes, where everyone has their own pension pot. But actually, most people don't know the difference between a stock and a bond. And it makes sense in many situations to manage the risks around old age collectively through, say, collective defined contribution schemes, which would make more sense as a way to use pooled mechanisms to share risks. Now, your question about the UK and kind of what current thinking is, I think recent decisions in the UK show in some ways, quite the opposite approach. They've actually made decisions around tax cuts that will involve quite a lot of redistribution in favor of the rich. And in some ways harking back to sort of this kind of notion of trickle down, that you let the rich accumulate more and then some of it they'll invest and then some of that will benefit the wider population. So I'm rather skeptical that that's actually a good economic strategy. I think a much more powerful economic strategy is what economists call pre-distribution, where you invest a lot in people up front, in early years education, in lifelong learning, invest in deprived parts of a country so that people have a chance to actually earn an income. I think if you have to do a lot of redistribution, it means your pre-distribution has failed, that you haven't invested enough in your population so that they can earn a decent wage without having to rely on redistribution.
And yet, the electoral payback on pre-distribution is maybe sometimes a bit of a deterrent for politicians in modern democracies who need more instant results than the results that one might get out of furthering education. Would you say that that's maybe a hindrance, that we live in a very immediate world where politicians need votes immediately?
Absolutely. And that, pre-distribution is a long-term business. You invest in early years education of children who happen to be born into poor families. And after 20 or 30 years, their incomes will be 40, 50% higher than otherwise. But of course, the politicians who made those wise investments won't be around in 20 or 30 years. And it is a real problem. It is a real problem. And I think we have to think really hard in democracies to say, how do we make sure that these long-term investments get made in a sensible way if we're so certain that they're the right thing to do?
I was very impressed in your book that obviously you're relying on a lot of data. It seems to me that in order to enact a just and efficient social contract, and maybe efficient isn't the right word, but it's the word I'm going to use now. One needs lots of data, and data science certainly is a discipline that's really coming to the forefront of policymaking. Is good data the lifeblood of a healthy social contract? I know that the LSE has recently been developing its resources in data sciences. Can you tell us a little bit more about your views on that and how you're developing that at the LSE?
Yeah, definitely. So data can definitely help inform a better social contract. In fact, the LSE was founded by the Fabians, who really believed in the power of evidence and to make society better. And, from the very beginning, they were doing things like Charles Booth did the first poverty map of London, where they went round into poor households across London to map what poor people had, what rich people had, and what the different standards of living and how that translated itself into hard data in terms of incomes and living standards. And so that was really important for informing thinking about the poor laws and poverty in the UK as early as Victorian times. And the LSE very much maintains that slightly nerdy tradition of believing in evidence and data and quantification. And the digital revolution has meant that we can do that on a scale, heretofore unimaginable. And there's some very good examples that I cite in the book of how the use of big data has become really important for understanding the social contract. I'll just give an example. In the book, I cite this research called Lost Einsteins, which was done by a colleague at the LSE and somebody at Harvard. And they take data of children who in year 4 have the same science and math skills, and they look at what happens to their income later in life, and they look at how many of them become inventors and have patents. And what they find is that if you are born into a rich family, you're 10 times more likely to have a patent than another child born into a poor family, even if you had the exact same math and science skills. Similarly, if you're born in Silicon Valley, you're 10 times more likely to have a technology patent than if you're born elsewhere. And what the ability to use that big data enables us to do is to really understand how where you're born and what family you're born into has implications throughout your life, not just in terms of your income, but also in terms of your ability to be an innovator and an inventor. And we could have never answered that kind of question before without that kind of really big data. And so we're very excited. We've created a Data Sciences Institute at the LSE, and it's supporting all disciplines. That's the other thing that's really interesting. Political science, sociology, anthropology, media studies, economics are all now relying increasingly on using big data to answer big questions.
Final question. Obviously, in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of attention on the monarchy due to the death of the Queen. And I think there's some debate, I guess, in the UK around the role of the monarchy in society and in forging a sense of identity. How do you view this kind of institution through the prism of a new social contract? You yourself are a member of an institution that people abroad may not really understand, the House of Lords. How do you think these institutions fit into a new social contract?
So, I was thinking about this question. I mean, I think part of the reason there was such an outpouring of gratitude for the Queen after she died was she kept her promise. She promised a lifetime of service until the day she died, and she did that. And in an era when many politicians make promises that they don't deliver on, I think what she did was especially appreciated in the current context. She kept up her part of the social contract that she made with society. So I think that's part of the power of what happened. Partly, and it's partly particularly acute because there's huge cynicism these days about political leaders and politicians and whether they're trustworthy and whether they keep their promises. Now, I think also that the social contract evolves, and even institutions like the monarchy have evolved enormously and will probably continue to evolve in the future. You know, other societies have monarchies, but they ask very different things of them and they support them in different ways. And I suspect we will see a new social contract with the head of state, not just in the UK, but in other countries too, as people's values and expectations change.